Hey guys, it's chapter 11, Religion and Reform, 1800 to 1860. We're going to be talking about four major movements: the reform movements, transcendentalism, utopian communities, abolitionists, and women's rights. And within them, we'll talk about their goals, their leaders, and the actions that they took. So let's get right to it with transcendentalism and Ralph Waldo Emerson. By definition, transcendentalism is an intellectual movement rooted in the religious soils of New England. So it derives a lot of their ideas from the Puritan faith. Basically, what it means, transcendentalists believe people could go beyond logic and knowledge, but to learn the infinite and the eternal, whether that be spiritual or another experience outside their own body. Ralph Waldo Emerson is considered the founder of transcendentalism. Now, Emerson rejected tradition and he practiced self-discipline and civic responsibility. So, while he did not like the norms of society for his times, he did not advocate an overthrow of social norms. Rather, that the emphasis should be the individual, and that the individual should be able to realize whatever he or she wanted. So this becomes known as freedom of the self. One of his major pupils was Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau lived for 2 years in the woods of Concord, Massachusetts in search of himself. He encouraged people to go beyond artificial society, to avoid conformity, and resist unjust laws peacefully. So this is kind of like civil unrest. And this is his famous book called Walden, which is where he lived out in the woods in search of something outside himself in spirituality. Women were also touched by the transcendentalist movement. Probably the most known woman is Margaret Fuller. So Margaret Fuller advocated for women liberty and freedom. Again, that is the self, that's the individual. She believed that every woman deserves psychological and social independence. Fuller's writing inspired women to become writers and reformers. And transcendentalists, for the most part, were optimistic, and they believed that nothing was impossible for the individual who could break free of traditions. Here is one of the most famous quotes by Margaret Fuller. She believed that women deserve the ability to grow as an intellect, to discern as a soul, to live freely and unimpeded. And I believe that that is true. So, some transcendentalists, however, were not as optimistic as these three that we just talked about. One of them was Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne was more of a pessimistic view, and he believed that egotism could destroy, not liberate the self. So he, in essence, was challenging Emerson. He believed that selfish acts led to a profound sense of guilt and condemnation, and to prove that, he wrote a book called The Scarlet Letter, which you probably have heard of. In 1850, this is the story of a Puritan community where a preacher and one of his followers engaged in adultery, and they actually have a child. And according to the Scarlet Letter, the preacher and the female who he had an affair with were liberating themselves, but that led to a guilty conscience and eventually to the destruction of the community. Now, adulteresses, women who lived in New England, were forced to wear an A for adultery, which warned the community of her immoral life and also ostracized the individual. Another author who wrote of the dark side of humanity was Herman Melville. His book, Moby Dick. You probably have heard of it. Talks about a captain chasing a whale. So this book describes the destruction of the self by Captain Ahab's obsession to avenge the death of his crew members by this great whale. However, in his big obsession, he ended up causing the rest of his crew members' lives as well as his own. So the idea of self, to please yourself, which includes obsession, led to Captain Ahab's destruction. And here's a quote by Ahab. He said, I'll chase him around Good Hope, and around the Horn, and around the Norway Maelstrom, and around Perdition's Flame before I give up. In other words, he was saying that the Captain Ahab was going to chase this whale everywhere the whale went, so long as he got revenge. In the end, it actually ended up costing him his life. The next movement that we're going to talk about pretty quickly is utopian communities. So utopian communities were ideal communities, the perfect communities. These communities were symbols of social protest, and they believe in communal ownership of property, not individual owners of property. Now, one of the ways how they challenged some of these traditionalist ideas, that it established new gender roles. Women were part of the main street in these communities. They were able to cut their hair short. They challenged class division, and this established a cultural blueprint of an egalitarian society. A particular example here is what becomes known as the Oneida community, which is in Oneida, New York. John Humphreys Noyes was the leader of this community, and he rejected marriage on the basis that it prevented perfection. However, he did have some radical ideas, like something becomes known as complex marriage, where people were able to be married to anybody they wanted in the community at any point. So the community, for the most part, did well at the first place. They were able to produce silverware, but after Knowles was being prosecuted for adultery, he fled to Canada, and the community pretty much ended there. So these communities were a blueprint, again, of a more egalitarian society and an economic order. Another such form community comes from the Mormons, actually. So this is the Mormon Trails. So Joseph Smith is the founder of the Mormons. Smith believed that God chose him to reveal his last vision of the truth. He established a patriotic society first in New York in search of social perfection that encouraged hard work and enterprise. Now, anti-Mormons in New York forced Smith to leave New York, and he ended up settling in these other places, Missouri, and then he ended up in Nauvoo, Illinois, if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm not sure. Now, in Illinois, he actually justified polygamy, the practice of having more than one wife. Anti-Mormons did not really like this, and while he was awaiting trial in jail, a mob broke him and murdered him. The new leader was Brigham Young. So Brigham Young realized the persecution of the Mormon faith in New York, and he eventually moved the community to Salt Lake City. Again, this is part of an example of a utopian community. Brigham Young takes the realms as the leader of the Mormon faith. He moved into Salt Lake City, Utah, where he was named governor of the territory, not a state at that point. Now, conflict did arise between the federal government and the Mormons over polygamy, and polygamy delayed Utah's statehood until 1896. And pretty much anybody who was not Mormon was not welcome in the community. If you were not Mormon, you were not allowed to vote, you were not allowed to own property, you were not allowed to own your own businesses. So it became conflict in this community. However, if you were Mormon, you pretty much thrive in this community. So that was the utopian community. Now, as these communities were being established throughout the U.S., so we talk about Oneida, New York over here, and Salt Lake City over here, there was also immigrants who were moving into societies. So as the utopian communities tried to perfect rural communities, cities became more secular and promiscuous. City growth was caused by immigration. Young men and women were in search of adventure and fortune, but what awaited them was hard labor, poor living conditions. Girls between the ages of 15 and 20 turned to prostitution just to get by. Most of their clients were, quote, respectable, unquote, men. And prostitution, as you would imagine, led to an increase in diseases and death rates. Now, there was new forms of entertainment for the masses. Prostitution was considered one of them. And what you see here is a chart of immigrants coming in. So we see here the German Revolution fail and a lot of Germans coming in. And also right around the same time, we have the Irish potato famine, and this also brought in a lot of Irish coming here as well. So there was a group of people called the nativists. These nativists were whites who wanted an all-white American and discriminated and assaulted Irish and German immigrants. They restricted Irish workers to the most menial jobs, used policies to leave foreign-born residents out of jobs, education, and certain neighborhoods as well. So we do see a discrimination by the nativists. This is the second time we talked about this group, so it's something that you probably should know by now. Now, other forms of entertainments that arise in the cities is what becomes known as minstrels. So minstrels were theoretical shows where white actors would blacken their face to present comedies. Now, behind that comedy, there was discrimination. So these minstrels were a form of discrimination by poking fun at African Americans and portraying them as lazy and irresponsible and exaggerating some of the racial features. And here's a pamphlet of the almanac of these minstrels. And again, you could kind of see the ideal African American from the perspective of the whites. However, it was not just African Americans that were being ridiculed in these shows. The minstrels actors also ridicule Irish and German people for being drunks. They ridicule women in public life as prostitutes, those women who were trying to advance society, and they also mock the upper class. So the minstrels actually led to a spread of hatred throughout the U.S. And one of those hatreds was, unfortunately, slavery. However, we do start seeing also more and more people standing up for what they believe was right. And here is one, David Walker. He writes a pamphlet called Appeal. Now, David Walker was a free black from North Carolina who moved to Houston. Walker justified slaves' rebellions and warned of a slave revolt. He said, "Woe if we have to obtain our freedoms by fighting." In essence, he was saying that African Americans were willing to fight and, if needed, die for their freedom. Now, his pamphlets, probably considered the most radical form of abolitionist because it advocated violence, had wide appeal. Even Southerners read it, and a lot of times, abolitionists actually didn't really like it. But this also incited other rebellions. The most famous one, by the mid-1800s, was Nat Turner. So Nat Turner was from Southampton County, Virginia, and Turner and another 50 or so slaves led an insurrection on August 1831, killing more than 50 whites, including men, women, and children. Now, the slaves were ill-equipped and poorly trained as a militia force, so when the white militia came in, they were able to put down the rebellion, killing 40 blacks and beheading another 15, and putting their heads on posts as a warning for the other slaves thinking of rebellion. After Nat Turner's rebellion, Virginia, the state where the rebellion took place, tightened its slave codes. They limited black movement, prohibited anyone from teaching slaves to read and write, like Walker's Appeal, because they felt that Walker's Appeal led to this slave revolt and slave insurrection. But white blacks were not the only ones who were against slavery. We do have abolitionists in the North. Probably the most important abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. He was from Massachusetts and he had his printing shop. He was again the loudest voice for abolitionists. In 1831, he establishes the Liberator, which you see here. This is the top picture of the Liberator. You see black, Jesus, and whites, and they're all, the banner here says, "Love thy neighbor as you love yourself." And you see here with an auction, a slave auction, yet on the back side of that house, you're seeing slaves that are being liberated. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. So he established the Liberator, a newspaper that attacked slavery at its core. And he also founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society. So William Lloyd Garrison, he called for immediate emancipation without compensation to slave masters. And they launched a three-pronged attack on slavery. The first one, to use the Bible to discredit slavery. The second tactic that they used was aiding fugitive slaves via the Underground Railroad by providing lodgings and eventually jobs. The Underground Railroad was an informal network of whites and free blacks that assisted fugitive slaves. Thousands of slaves gained their freedom via the Underground Railroad. Prime examples are Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was an African-American female who went down to the South after she escaped to help more slaves. Story says that Tubman helped over 300 people gain their freedom. And what you see in the map is the purple states represent the slave states, and the orange states represent the free states. This green here represents where slave population was over 50% of the community. So there were some communities where the majority of the people were slaves, and the arrows kind of give you an idea of where the Underground Railroad left. A lot of the slaves that were free, they were originally from Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri because they were right border states. Down here in the deep South, a lot more harder to escape. But this was one of the second ways that they tried to attack slavery. And the third way was political campaigns. So abolitionists petitioned Congress to emancipate all slaves. Abolitionists wrote letters to Congress demanding an end to slavery in Washington, D.C., an end to interstate slave trade, and a ban on admissions of new states who want to be slaves. Now, Congress responded with what becomes known as the gag rule in 1835. The gag rule is pretty much congressmen ignoring abolitionist letters to avoid further conflict. So though the abolition movement big grew, it remained small. Only about 10% of Northerners and Midwesterners were abolitionists. And this chart kind of gives you an idea who we have the key here. So the darker red represents women who were abolitionists, and the white were men who were abolitionists. For the most part, most of the abolitionists were females. They outnumbered men about 2/3 to 1/3 here. And notice most of the people all the people that were abolitionists, they were all in the North. So not a whole lot of abolitionists, at least in this map, in the South. Now, some people they support slavery, people in the South and in the North. Clergymen warned that abolitionists would divide families. Free slaves could overthrow churches, education, and other institutions. Clergy also condemned the public role of female abolitionists, and Northerners feared that free blacks would work for lower wages and take over their jobs. Merchants and textile manufacturers in the North also supported Southern plantations because that was what kept their factories running. And mobs attacked respectable black men, temple homes, churches, black orphanage as well. So blacks had it a little bit better in the North, but it wasn't always equal. Even William Lloyd Garrison was attacked by a white mob, and his body was dragged to the streets of Boston because Some Northerners did not agree with his views of abolitionism.